Greetings. I'm Pastor Diana Thompson. I'm the called pastor at the Canton City Lutheran Parish in Canton, Ohio, and the administrative pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. Welcome. This is a Bible study on the book of Acts, or otherwise known as the Acts of the Apostles. We are in episode 33 of this study. And welcome back to those who have joined me before. And if you've come across this video randomly while searching the web, I hope you find this time of Bible study fulfilling, inspiring for you. You're welcome to start with this session or this episode, or you can go to the YouTube channel and start from episode 1. That is up to you. Please, whatever works for you. This is what God is calling for us. And the reason I do these Bible studies is to help all of us grow in faith, learn more about the gospel and the story of God and God in our life. So you will find that at the end of this episode, there will be my email address, my social media contacts, but I encourage you to put your thoughts, reflections, questions in the comments on the YouTube channel, but if you prefer something more private, you're welcome to reach out to me through those other media sources as well. It is always a joy to have you with me. I encourage you to have 3 tools available. First, a Bible, translation of your choice, digital, printed, whatever you have access to. The second is paper, and the third is a pen or pencil. And I encourage you to use that paper and pen or pencil to write down questions, comments, reflections. If you need to pause the video because you got inspired to write a poem or draw a picture, whatever, use those resources as you feel God calling you. We all learn in different ways. We all absorb information in different ways, so use those as you wish. You are always welcome to pause the video if you need a break, if life interrupts, and then you're welcome to come back as you are able. Again, you are in control of this study. I offer this as a gift to you, and so use it as you feel God calling you. So as I mentioned, we are in episode 33. We are concluding chapter 22 and beginning chapter 23. We will be looking at Paul's trial before the Sanhedrin or the Jewish council, and then we'll be talking about a plot to kill Paul. So we're going to start at chapter 22 verse 30 and continue through chapter 23 verse 22. So there are 6 themes that run between the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, these are 2 parts of the same story. So the author of the Gospel of Luke and the author of Acts appears to be the same person between writing style, themes that run throughout both books. So these themes I'm going to touch on here, and then we'll explore later to see if those themes are lifted up in our reflection and study today. We won't touch on all the themes. No one story reaches all of the themes, but let's talk about them as they fit into, I'm going to say Luke as the author, through this narrative of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. So the themes are 1, God's redemptive purposes, 2, salvation for all alike, 3, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth, 4, table fellowship, 5, the role of a disciple, and 6, the importance of an accurate witness. So as we get into our study today, remember we are still in Jerusalem. Paul has been charged with desecrating the temple. There was an accusation that he brought a Gentile into the sacred space, which is false. But there was a mob that was stirred up against him. The tribune brought in soldiers and centurions to withdraw Paul from there. Paul stood in front of the tribune. He was then addressed the crowd, and again, the people weren't ready to listen, and so the tribune again put him under protective custody, and it was revealed now that Paul is a Roman citizen, so that changes the dynamic with the tribune. And we now find ourselves kind of following up. The tribune recognizes what's going on. He realizes that the charges against Paul are not a civil matter, but actually a religious matter. So he moves this discussion back to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council in Jerusalem, and is trying to put this back into the place of authority where it's supposed to be, that this is a religious disagreement and should be handled within the Jewish traditions and laws. So we come into chapter 22, verse 30, and we're going to go through chapter 23, verse 11, where Paul stands before the Sanhedrin or the council. I'm going to read the verses and then we'll break it down. Since a tribune wanted to find out what Paul was being accused of by the Jews, the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and the entire council to meet. He brought Paul down and had him stand before them. While Paul was looking intently at the council, he said, "Brothers, up to this day I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God." Then the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. At this, Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law? Yet in violation of the law, you order me to be struck?" Those standing nearby said, "Do you dare to insult God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not realize, brothers, that he was high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a leader of your people.'" When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others Pharisees, he called out to the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am in trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees' group stood up and contended, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" When the dissension became violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him by force, and bring him into the barracks. That night the Lord stood near him and said, "Keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome." So just a reminder, the tribune is trying to force the Jewish leaderships to take on their proper role to deal with internal conflict within the Jewish community. But as we see in this encounter before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, there is so much dissension already within the Jewish community, and this desire to undermine Paul is just not helping. And Paul, in his defense, recognizes the division already in the Jewish community and uses that and lifts up that for the reality that what he's preaching should be unifying rather than divisive. But first, let's start with verse 30. Verse 30 is a transitional verse. It takes us from Paul standing trial with the tribune understanding that Paul is a Roman citizen and the situation isn't civil. And then, so the tribune releases Paul in the sense of Paul is no longer under arrest by the Roman authorities. And then he orders the Sanhedrin to gather, which, since this is a religious matter, he has some authority to do because he wants to stop the dissension. So he orders the council to gather to resolve this conflict. As you can see, it does anything but. So we move into this hearing and time before the council at verse 1 of chapter 23. So this is supposed to be an informal hearing, and Paul addresses the council, and he starts first with a profession that he lives in a clear conscience before God, that he has followed the law, that he does not believe that anything he has done is in opposition to what God has asked of him. And so this is a really interesting reality, because when Paul declares that he is in a clear conscience, the leader of the Sanhedrin doesn't respond or ask questions, but instead orders people standing next to Paul to strike him. Like somehow he is just being rude and offensive to the council, which is not the case. And it ultimately shows that this council isn't being faithful to what it's called to. They keep saying that they are upholding the law, yet Paul was physically attacked instead of given the opportunity to be questioned, to defend himself. This is completely inappropriate behavior by the high priest. So in verse 3, Paul calls out Ananias, the chief priest. And he basically said, you keep saying you're the ones upholding the law, but you're the ones who are false. And when he uses this illusion of a whitewashed wall, he is actually going back to I lost my spot. He's actually going back to Leviticus by saying they're violating the law. They are acting in violence, which is a way to punish, and it is against Leviticus 19:15 to punish a powerless, innocent person. So what the whitewashed wall is that is an echo of Ezekiel 13, chapter 10. And it is Ezekiel the prophet condemning the hypocrisy of the leaders of Israel by calling them builders of a weak wall that is obscured by a veneer of white paint. So the fact that Paul calls out Ananias using this allusion to Ezekiel is a reminder that they really are unrepentant, that they are not ready to hear what is going on. So first of all, it was illegal and inappropriate for Ananias to have Paul struck because he was still innocent. He had not been proven guilty of anything. There was no reason for a physical attack nor physical punishment. So Paul basically says, you guys are just a veneer. You aren't really the people you say you are. And he goes on, you sit there in judgment according to the law, yet violate the law when you ordered me to be struck. And so, of course, instead of listening to what Paul says, that people stand up and are offended because they feel that Paul was insulting the high priest. And that's in verse 4. This is such an amazing human nature situation where people are so determined to defend their position that they are willing to step over their own claimed values and purpose to just make sure that they are right. They don't like what Paul is doing, and they are doing everything they can to undermine Paul, even if it means breaking the laws they keep saying that they uphold. And I think this is really an interesting reality about the nature of humanity and our desire to be right, even when all the evidence points to us being in the wrong direction. So Paul is faithfully preaching this gospel, this good news of Christ that has been given to him. But the leaders are so entrenched in defending what they believe to be the truth that they are unwilling to hear what God is doing and are unwilling to be repentant and moving in a new direction. And we are all guilty of that at various times and in various ways in our lives, whether it's because of God or because we are embarrassed by something and we are going to double down on being right, even when we know that what we're doubling down on doesn't actually move our life forward. We want to be right. We want to be vindicated, regardless of if we have to step on our principles to verify it. And I think that is really a key thing for us to reflect on, especially in the world when we start right now where everything is so polarized, to really make sure we understand our core values and principles and make sure we hold those instead of just defending ourselves and proving ourselves right. Because when we're willing to grow, which is really what the gospel is about, to really be repentant, to grow into who God calls us to be, then we can stand on our principles, we can hold our values, and we don't have to defend ourselves when we could actually be learning and growing. There is opportunity for learning and growth for everyone, regardless of how well we think we have our lives together or what we think we're defending. And this is what I see playing out in this council situation. They are so determined to hold on to their authority and power. They're so determined to undermine Paul that they are actually breaking the laws they themselves believe and say are most important to them. So Paul's response when he's charged with insulting the high priest says, "I didn't realize, brothers, that he was a high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a leader of your people." And that's in verse 5. He really is reminding folks that the high priest isn't being authentic in his role, and really, unfortunately, kind of saying, you aren't the people you keep saying you are. You aren't living up to the expectations and the rules that you yourself know. Now, then Paul, whether in an attempt to manipulate or to really call into question what he's being charged for. So he's being charged for preaching a risen Messiah, a resurrected Messiah. And in verse 6 and following, he calls out the division within the Sanhedrin, because there's Sadducees and Pharisees. The Pharisees believe in the resurrection, and the Sadducees do not. So he reminds folks in verse 6 that he is a Pharisee. He was raised in a Pharisaic family. And he says, my trial really is concerning the resurrection of the dead. And with that, he triggers the dissension within the Sanhedrin between the Sadducees and the Pharisees because they don't agree. They don't agree in the resurrection of the dead. They don't agree on the on the idea of angels or messengers of God. And then, of course, they also, this idea of angels or spirit. Those are three things that those two bodies, those two different Jewish subgroups disagree on. And in that, then became this internal dynamic of disagreement between the Sadducees and the Pharisees on the council. And it created this huge clamor. And then, of course, the scribes step in. The scribes are the ones who really are the ones who understand, have studied the law. These are the ones who would declare kind of the reality of this. And they stand up and they say, we find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? So this is, again, another piece of conflict within there. The scribes, the lawyers say, he's not done anything wrong. What if God is calling him? What if God is sending him messengers or a spirit from the divine? By law, he's done nothing wrong. So we see this basically breakdown of the Sanhedrin, of the council. And as this chaos ensues, the tribune once again sends in the soldiers to withdraw Paul because he's afraid that Paul is just going to be beat to death in the chaos of what's ensuing. So once again, the tribune intervenes, brings Paul into protective custody. And as you can see, the council, the Sanhedrin, has just devolved into a crazy mess. So then in verse 11, Paul gets another message from God. Another visitation. Is that an angel, a spirit? However you want to describe it. So in verse 11, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, you must bear witness also in Rome." So it's really interesting how, once again, Luke has another visitation, reaffirming. This is the third time that Paul's travel to Rome is affirmed through vision, angel, messenger. And it really emphasizes what Luke wants everyone who's reading this to know. God is taking Paul to Rome. Nothing is going to stand in Paul's way to do that. And I think that is interesting as we think about Jesus's determination to be in Jerusalem, even though people were trying to talk Jesus out of that, because Jesus knew that in Jerusalem he would die. So there is some parallel, not that Paul is the salvation, but that Paul's purpose is godly directed. And just like Jesus's mission and ministry was godly directed. Again, keep up your courage. It's a reminder that God is the one in power. God has a plan. And no matter what seems to be going on and how unreasonable it seems that Paul would actually make it to Rome, to trust that God is at work. So the next part in chapter 23, verses 12 through 22, we hear about a plot to kill Paul. So let me read those verses for you. In the morning, the Jews joined in a conspiracy and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There was more than 40 who joined in this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the council must notify the tribune to bring him down to you, on the pretext that you want to make a more thorough examination of his case, and we are ready to do away with him before he arrives." Now the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush, so he went and gained entrance to the barracks and told Paul. Paul called to one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to report to him." So the centurion took him, brought him to the tribune, and said, "The prisoner Paul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you." The tribune took him by the hand, drew him away privately, and asked, "What is it that you have to report to me?" He answered, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more thoroughly into his case. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him. They have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they kill him. They are ready now and are waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, ordering him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of this." So now, as the saying goes, the plot thickens. We now see a conspiracy. We see some Jews who are determined to kill Paul, and they recruit some of the chief priests of the Sanhedrin to create an opportunity for them to assassinate Paul. And so this conspiracy, this intrigue, to get Paul transferred from the tribune's custody back to the council is really just a setup. And ultimately, as we will know, because God keeps promising that Paul will make it to Rome, that this plot can't come to fruition. But the reader may wonder, we may ask questions, but why is this hatred so intense? What is going on? But yet Luke is really only concerned with the tension, but doesn't explain the antagonist's motives. Their hostility towards him is not with Paul the Jew. He clearly has the practice and pedigree that says that is not the concern. So is this about his ministry to the Gentiles? Is it because it threatens the understanding of the traditional Jewish life experience? Is this just, again, that determination to be unrepentant, to not be willing to see where God is work, to hold on to something that is going on before? But needless to say, there is also a nationalistic and ethnocentric fervor that was going on in Palestine at this time. So this need to keep Israel pure, to not the nation, but the people of Israel. This protective nature. And again, there might feel like there's outside threats. We as human beings tend to be nationalistic and ethnocentric when we feel threatened by other people, when we think that we're losing something. And our response is to huddle in or circle the wagons, which is a great phrase, to self-protect. And this was underlying what was going on. Obviously, Rome was an occupying force. There were people coming into Jerusalem who were not Jewish, even the idea of the Hellenists, people who were coming in because they were part of the Roman Empire. There's probably some fear of the loss of their identity. They are not the nation of Israel. They are a subsidiary of the empire. So there's this underlying issue. And of course, Paul reaching out to Gentiles and calling them into a life of faith is triggering some of that. So we're not exactly sure what was going on and exactly why, but we obviously see that this violence and aggression towards Paul has been increasing ever since Paul returned to Jerusalem. And now we have an intentional plot to assassinate him. So whatever it is about Paul's message feels threatening to the Jews in Jerusalem. And they are ready to destroy Paul to protect what they feel is the right thing to do. Now, note, we don't really get any information about the identity or the motive of these 40 Jews who joined together in the conspiracy. Maybe they were, again, just really feeling protective of what was happening. But we also have to remember that in verse 21, verse 38, the tribune was referring to some assassins before and thought maybe Paul was one of them. So there is this underlying political unrest in Palestine. where violent activists are on the political landscape. So are these part of that assassin group? Probably not, but clearly it's kind of the underlying culture that, you know, the answer to your problem is destroying the person who is the problem. It clearly shows some religious fanaticism, and this is indicated by their oath not to eat or drink until they've completed their goal. So it really does feel like these are devout Jews who feel like this assassination is their service to God, and they're doing it on behalf of the people of Israel. I hear this and I think so much about, again, the extremism that we're experiencing in our culture and in our society, and especially in our country right now, that people are just radicalized on the left and on the right. It doesn't really matter, to take these huge extreme measures, to use violence as a way to promote their cause or to destroy those they believe are in opposition. And again, that is not how God works. That is not how faith is expressed. Jesus never said, go out and destroy your enemy. He actually said the opposite. We are supposed to pray for those who curse us, turn the other cheek. I mean, there's so many things. So the fact that there's this radicalism in response to Paul and a desire to actually have him assassinated talks about the extreme desire to self-protect. And I think we as Christians need to really be prayerful and intentional when we are willing to turn to violence in the name of God. And this is one of those moments where, you know, again, yes, I understand Old Testament law allows for stoning and other physical punishments and death for breaking the law. But again, they have yet to find a reason to do that for Paul. They keep making up things, trying to find reasons to undermine him, just as they did Jesus. And now they're just willing to flat out break the law, to assassinate him, to stop him from doing what is going on. So the fact is, we have the 40 people who have committed to the assassination, but then they add the chief priests and elders. So these are, again, assumed to be part of the Sanhedrin, to add to the conspiracy to set up the situation that allows for the assassination. So the fact is, you know, the Sanhedrin and those who are participating in this conspiracy are doing the exact opposite of what the law would allow. And again, it's quite explicit, this assassination. The setup is that Paul is supposed to be transferred to the council to be asked more questions, to you know, continue this hearing. But the only purpose for this call to the council was to create a transition spot where the assassins could strike. Now we have an interesting new character, Paul's nephew, a young man, in verses 16 through 22, hears of the rumors of the ambush and gains access to Paul. Now this would not be uncommon. As a family member, he might have the right to go visit Paul, but he warns Paul of what is going on. He warns Paul of the dangers that are happening, and Paul asks him to then go to the tribune and explain what is going on. And it is always interesting that it now becomes the Roman leader who is the one who works on God's behalf to protect Paul. So his nephew comes and shares the story, but the tribune is the one who actually is doing the work of God. He keeps Paul in a protective situation. He recognizes that this is potential reality. And of course, Paul, as a Roman citizen, would be afforded the privilege if there was an assassination attempt and it was known. The tribune really, as a Roman agent, would need to protect him. But it really ultimately comes down to God is using the people available to fulfill God's desire and plan for Paul to get to Rome. And I think that's important for us to remember as well, that God uses unexpected people to do God's work. Not because the tribune was faithful, not because the tribune had converted, but because God had access to change the trajectory and make sure that Paul got to where Paul needed to be. So again, this unrepentant Israel revealed to us through this council who was unwilling to, one, work within itself, but two, to be authentic to who they were supposed to be. And then these assassins who are willing to defend the faith or protect the community or whatever their motive is. We really don't know, again, why they decided to join in this conspiracy, but they just felt that they needed to get rid of Paul. But yet these unrepentant agents of Israel are undermined. God will not allow them to thwart God's work and God's plan. So again, Rome, this agent of Rome, is more faithful in following the right path, even though it's by Roman constitution and law, than the leaders of Israel, who are supposed to be the ones who are the model of the law for the people of God. So again, this way that God works, when the people of God are not doing what God calls them to be, if they're not being faithful to who God calls them to be, then God will use other sources. And God will not allow those people to continue to be in authority. Now, they might be in authority longer than we want them to be, but they cannot undermine the will of God. So now here we are. The tribune is aware of the plot to kill Paul. He's asked Paul's nephew not to share any of the news that the tribune, knows what is going on. And in our next episode, we'll see what the tribune does to protect Paul. So let's go back and look at those 6 themes and see, excuse me, and see which ones that are lifted up in our stories today. So 1, God's redemptive purposes. I'm not sure that is a key piece in our stories today. Clearly all of God's work is about redemption. The only part we really hear is how these leaders of Israel are just not ready to enter into the redemptive process. 2, salvation for all alike. This is, again, not really a key point here. The only, excuse me, the only area we really see that is that Paul says, he's on trial because he's talking about the resurrection. But that's really kind of the only point here. 3, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth are not a topic here. 4, table fellowship is not a topic here. 5, the role of a disciple, I think, is the key theme that we have here. Paul being faithful in and out. Paul speaking words of hope and redemption, and calling out the inauthentic behavior of those who keep saying that they're the agents of God. So this is that faithful role of a disciple. 6, the importance of an accurate witness. Again, this is not about our accurate witness, it's about Luke's accurate witness. So again, he's very concise about the role of the council. He's concise about the role of the tribune. He recognizes and acts on Roman law, Israel's law. So this is how Luke makes sure that his story is authentic, it's accurate, by honoring the diversity and the nature and history that is currently in place. So as I mentioned in our next episode, episode 34, we are concluding chapter 23 and beginning chapter 24. We'll be discussing Paul's sent to Felix the governor, and then Paul standing before Felix at Caesarea. So we'll be in chapter 23, starting at verse 23 through chapter 4, verse 9. As always, it is a joy to have you with me today. As I mentioned before, post questions, comments, reflections, inspirations in the comments section on the YouTube channel, or feel free to reach out to me on my social media or email, which we'll see in just a moment. Grace and peace to you, my dear Theophilus. God is with you.